Sometimes a man reaches the point where he's buried more friends than he can remember their names. Ulfar Ironhand knew that feeling well as he climbed the mountain, seeking peace from a lifetime of war. The giant Viking found a house hidden in the peaks. Smoke rose from its chimney. Someone lived there. He went inside, expecting to find strangers or enemies. Instead, he discovered something impossible. The house was filled with things from his childhood. A wooden horse he'd played with as a boy, runes carved with his real name, a cloak with his family's symbol. These belonged to his mother, who died in a raid 30 years ago. But if she was dead, how was her house here? And why did it feel like she was waiting for him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Battle of Stamford Bridge had ended 3 days ago, and still Ulfar could taste the iron of blood on his tongue. Not his own blood. He bore only shallow cuts across his massive frame, but the blood of fallen comrades whose names echoed in his mind like funeral chants. Bjorn the Bold, who had saved his life in Norway. Eric Redbeard, who could make any man laugh even as arrows flew overhead. Young Thorvald, barely 18, who had died calling for his mother. Ulfar Ironhand sat on a fallen log at the edge of the battlefield, watching ravens feast on what remained of glory. His war axe, Skull Splitter, lay across his knees, its blade still stained despite repeated cleaning. The weapon had served him faithfully for 15 years, since he had first lifted it as a young warrior, eager to prove himself worthy of his father's name. Now it felt heavier than a millstone, weighted with the souls of those it had sent to Valhalla. The morning sun cast long shadows across the field where English and Norse warriors lay tangled together in death's embrace. King Harold Godwinson had fallen, struck down by Norman arrows, and with him had died the old ways that Ulfar understood. The world was changing, becoming something foreign and unwelcome. Vikings were no longer the terror of the seas, but relics of a fading age, their longships rusting in forgotten harbors. His surviving battle brothers had scattered like leaves in autumn wind. Some sailed home to Norway, carrying news of defeat to wives and children who would weep for husbands who would never return. Others sought service with Norman lords, trading their axes for silver and their honor for survival. A few simply vanished into the English countryside, perhaps hoping to disappear entirely from a world that no longer had place for them. But Ulfar could not return to his homeland. There was nothing for him there except empty halls and graves of kinfolk long buried. His father had died when Ulfar was 20, cut down by Danish raiders. His brothers had fallen in various campaigns across the years, their names carved into family stones that now stood weathered and forgotten. The great hall of his ancestors had burned during a clan feud 5 winters past, taking with it the last remnants of his heritage. No wife waited for his return. No children called him father. The only family he had known was the Brotherhood of Warriors, and they were either dead or scattered to the winds. At 43, Ulfar Ironhand found himself truly alone for the first time in his life. The memory that haunted him most was not of recent battles, but of a raid 30 years past, when he was still a beardless youth eager to prove himself. His village had been attacked by Danish wolves in the night. He remembered the orange glow of burning thatch, the screams of women and children, the clash of iron on iron. His mother, Astrid the Wise, had pushed him toward the forest, her last words still echoing in his mind. "Run, my son. Live to remember us." He had run, as she commanded, and lived to become one of the most feared warriors in the north. But remembering had become a curse rather than a blessing. Every night Astrid's face appeared in his dreams, sometimes proud, sometimes accusing. Why had he lived when so many others had perished? What purpose had driven him to survive battle after battle, only to end up alone on a field of corpses with nothing to show for his years of warfare? The answer came to him as he watched the ravens take flight. He was tired. Bone-deep, soul-weary, tired of killing and being killed at. Tired of the weight of Skull Splitter in his hands. Tired of sleeping with one eye open, waiting for the next battle horn to sound. Most of all, he was tired of the echoing emptiness where his heart should be. Standing slowly, Ulfar shouldered his pack and began walking north. Not toward any particular destination, he had no home to return to, but simply away from the battlefield and towards something he could not yet name. The road led through rolling English hills, dotted with sheep and small farms, where life continued its peaceful rhythm despite the great battle that had just been fought. Children played in yards while their mothers hung washing on lines, and men worked their fields as if kings had not died just leagues away. The sight of this ordinary life stirred something unexpected in Ulfar's chest. How long had it been since he had seen families living without fear of raid or battle? These English farmers had their own struggles, poor harvests, harsh winters, the constant threat of bandits, but they also had something he had never known, the simple contentment of building rather than destroying. For 3 days he walked, eating little and speaking to no one. The road gradually climbed into hill country, where farms grew smaller and more scattered. On the 4th day, he left the road entirely, following deer paths that led ever upward into wild country where few men ventured. The air grew thin and sharp, carrying the scent of snow from distant peaks. He had no clear destination in mind, only a growing certainty that his path lay in the mountains. Perhaps it was the promise of solitude that drew him, or the hope that in such remote places he might finally find silence from the ghosts that followed in his wake. Mountain folk were known to be different, harder, more independent, less concerned with the affairs of kings and kingdoms. Maybe among them he could simply disappear, becoming another weathered face around a fire rather than Ulfar Ironhand, slayer of hundreds. The path grew steeper and more treacherous with each passing day. Ancient cairns marked the way, stacks of stone left by previous travelers to guide those who came after. Some were old beyond memory, their stones green with moss and lichen. Others appeared freshly built, suggesting that this route was still occasionally used by traders or shepherds brave enough to venture into the high country. As he climbed, Ulfar found his breathing becoming labored, despite his warrior's conditioning. The air was thin here, and each step required more effort than the last. But with the physical strain came an unexpected sense of relief. For the first time in months, his mind was occupied with something other than memories of war. The simple challenge of placing one foot ahead of the other, of following the winding path without falling to his death, required all his attention. On the 7th day of his mountain journey, the path led through a narrow pass between towering cliffs of dark stone. The wind howled through this gap like the voices of angry spirits, forcing Ulfar to lean into its strength to avoid being blown from his feet. Ice formed in his beard despite the late summer season, and his hands grew numb even wrapped in thick gloves. Beyond the path descended slightly into a hidden valley unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls of stone rose on all sides like the inner courtyard of some giant's fortress, but the valley floor was green with hardy mountain grass and dotted with small clear streams. It was a secret place hidden from the world below, where a man might live his entire life without being discovered. And there, nestled against the far wall of the valley, where a waterfall cascaded down the cliff face, stood a house. It was not large, perhaps 3 rooms at most, but it was well built of seasoned timber with a roof of slate that had weathered many winters. Smoke rose from its stone chimney in a thin, steady column, indicating that someone was home. The sight of human habitation in this remote place struck Ulfar as so unexpected that he stopped walking and simply stared. Who could live in such a place? What manner of person would choose to make their home so far from other humans that reaching it required a week of dangerous climbing? As he watched, he saw no movement around the house, heard no voices or sounds of activity. Only that thin column of smoke gave evidence that the dwelling was occupied. Ulfar approached slowly, his hand instinctively moving to rest on Skullsplitter's handle. He meant no harm to whoever lived here, but a lifetime of warfare had taught him to be prepared for anything. Mountain folk were often suspicious of strangers, and some were known to be less than welcoming to those who discovered their hidden retreats. But as he drew closer, something about the house began to feel familiar. The proportions of its construction, the way the stones of its foundation were fitted together, even the angle at which it sat relative to the waterfall, all of it stirred memories he could not quite grasp. It was like trying to remember a dream upon waking, when fragments of image and emotion lingered just beyond conscious recall. The door was made of oak planks bound with iron, carved with protective runes that had been filled with white clay to make them stand out clearly. Ulfar recognized some of the symbols: wards against evil spirits, prayers for the safety of travelers, blessings upon the household within. But others were unfamiliar, worked in a style he had seen somewhere before but could not place. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. Whatever lay beyond that door would change something fundamental about his journey. He could feel it in the mountain air, in the way the valley seemed to hold its breath around him. This was a moment of decision, though he could not yet see what choices lay before him. Taking a deep breath of the thin mountain air, Ulfar Ironhand knocked 3 times upon the door and waited to see who or what would answer. The door swung open at his touch, revealing an interior that should not have existed. No one answered his knock, yet the house welcomed him with warmth that seemed to emanate from its very walls. Ulfar stepped across the threshold, his warrior instincts screaming warnings, even as his heart recognized something profound and impossible. The main room was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a ceiling supported by oak beams, carved with intricate knotwork. A fire burned cheerfully in the stone hearth, though he had seen no one tend it. The flames cast dancing shadows across walls lined with shelves, holding an assortment of objects that made his breath catch in his throat. There, on a shelf at eye level, sat a wooden horse, no longer than his palm. Its mane was carved with delicate care, and its sides bore tiny runic symbols that spelled out a name: Ulfar. Not Ironhand, the name he had earned through years of battle, but simply Ulfar, the name his mother had whispered when she tucked him into bed as a child. His hands trembled as he lifted the toy from its resting place. The wood was smooth from handling, worn soft by small fingers that had traced its contours countless times. He remembered this horse. He remembered sitting by the fire in his childhood home, making it gallop across imaginary battlefields while his mother spun wool and hummed old songs. But this horse had been lost in the raid that killed her. He had seen their house burning, had watched Danish raiders carry away everything of value. How could it be here, in a mountain refuge that existed beyond all maps and reason? Ulfar set the horse down with reverent care and continued exploring the room. Each object he discovered struck him like a physical blow. A bone comb with several teeth missing, the same comb his mother had used to untangle his hair after he returned from playing in the woods. A copper bowl dented on one side where he had dropped it as a boy, earning a gentle scolding and a lesson about treating precious things with care. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace sat a collection of smooth river stones, each one painted with a different rune. He knew these stones. His mother had made them to teach him the old writing, turning lessons into games by having him spell out words and simple phrases. The blue stone meant strength, the red one courage. The white stone, larger than the others, bore the rune for love, but it was the object resting in the place of honor that finally brought him to his knees. A cloak of deep blue wool hung from a wooden peg beside the hearth, its edges trimmed with silver thread worked in the pattern of ravens and wolves. The brooch that held it closed bore the sigil of his clan, a tree with roots that reached deep and branches that touched the sky. This was his mother's finest possession, the cloak she wore only on feast days and holy occasions. Ulfar reached out with shaking fingers to touch the fabric. It was real, solid, still carrying the faint scent of the herbs his mother had used to keep moths away. As his fingers traced the familiar pattern of the weave, he found something sewn into the inner fold, a small leather pouch no bigger than a child's fist. Inside the pouch was a stone unlike any he had ever seen. It was black as midnight, but shot through with veins of silver that seemed to move in the firelight. Carved into its surface were runes that spelled out his birth name, Ulfar Astridsson, son of Astrid the Wise. Below that, in smaller letters, were words that made his vision blur with unshed tears. My beloved son, my heart walks with you always. This was impossible. His mother had died 30 years ago in flames and screaming. He had been 13, old enough to understand death, old enough to grieve properly for the woman who had given him life and love in equal measure. Yet here was proof that she had not only survived, but had somehow made her way to this impossible place. Carrying with her the treasures of their shared past, Ulfar sank into the single chair beside the fire, the rune stone clutched in his massive hands. The room around him seemed to shimmer and shift, as if the boundaries between past and present were no longer fixed. He could almost hear his mother's voice, could almost see her moving about the room, tending the fire and humming the old songs she had taught him. The logical part of his mind, the part trained by years of warfare to assess threats and opportunities, insisted that this was some elaborate trap or delusion. Perhaps mountain madness had claimed him, the sickness that supposedly afflicted men who climbed too high too fast. Perhaps he was lying unconscious in some ravine, dreaming impossible dreams as he slowly froze to death. But the rune stone in his hands was warm and solid. The carved symbols were as clear as his own memories, and deep in his chest, a voice that sounded like truth whispered that his mother had indeed survived the raid that supposedly claimed her life. As if summoned by his thoughts, more memories began to surface, things he had forgotten or dismissed as the fantasies of a grieving child. How he had never found her body among the burned ruins of their village. How some of the other survivors had spoken of seeing a woman fleeing toward the forest even as the raiders struck. How his uncle, who had taken him in after the raid, had always changed the subject when young Ulfar asked too many questions about exactly how his mother had died. He had chosen to believe the easy story, that she had perished in the flames like so many others. It was simpler than hoping she might have escaped, simpler than wondering why she had never returned for him. But now, surrounded by impossible evidence of her survival, he was forced to confront a different truth. Astrid the Wise had not died in the raid. She had fled, as he himself had fled, carrying what treasures she could save. But while he had chosen the path of the warrior, becoming Ulfar Ironhand through blood and battle, she had chosen a different road. She had come to this hidden valley, built this house, and waited. But waited for what? For the wars to end? For him to grow tired of killing and seek her out? Or simply for death to claim her in peace rather than violence? The answer came as he noticed something else, a newer addition to the room that did not belong to his childhood memories. On a small table near the window sat a bound journal, its leather cover worn smooth by frequent handling. Beside it lay a writing quill and a pot of ink, both recently used. Ulfar opened the journal with trembling hands and found page after page covered in his mother's careful script. The entries were dated, beginning almost 29 years ago and continuing until he flipped to the final entry, just 3 months past. His throat constricted as he read the first words. Today I reached the valley that will be my home. The climb was hard, but Ulfar taught me to be strong. If my son still lives, if he ever tires of the warrior's path, perhaps he will find his way here. I will wait. Page after page chronicled her years in isolation, her thoughts of the son she had lost, her hopes that someday he might discover this refuge she had built for them both. She wrote of dreams where he appeared as a grown man, tall and fierce, but with the same gentle eyes he had possessed as a child. She wrote of watching the mountain paths, always hoping to see a familiar figure climbing toward her valley. The final entry was dated just 3 months ago, around the time of the great battle where he had lost so many friends. Her handwriting was weaker, more tremulous, but her words were clear. I grow tired, my son. If you do not come soon, I fear I will not be here to greet you. But this house will remain, and in it you will find all the love I could not give you in person. Follow the stones, beloved Ulfar. Find your way home." Through tears he had not shed since childhood, Ulfar read those final words again and again. She had waited for 30 years, through winters that must have been brutal and summers that brought their own hardships. Astrid the Wise had waited for her son to come home. Ulfar woke to sunlight streaming through windows he did not remember seeing the night before. For a moment, the familiar weight of Skull Splitter at his side and the scent of old wood made him think he was back in some forgotten warrior's hall after a night of drinking and storytelling. Then memory crashed over him like a cold wave, and he sat up with a gasp that echoed through the silent house. The journal lay open beside him where he had fallen asleep reading his mother's words. In the clear light of morning, he could see details that had escaped him in the firelight. The room was larger than most houses he had known, but every inch was filled with purpose. Herbs hung in carefully arranged bundles from the ceiling beams, lavender for peace, sage for protection. Others he recognized from his mother's healing work in their old village, but it was what he discovered in a wooden chest beneath the window that truly staggered him. The chest was made of oak, carved with the same protective runes that adorned the door. But these symbols were older, more elaborate. As he lifted the heavy lid, the scent of aged leather and parchment rose to greet him. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a book unlike any he had ever seen. The family Chronicle, as his mother had labeled it in her careful script, was bound in leather so old it had turned nearly black. The pages within were made of the finest vellum, each one covered with text, written in multiple hands, across what must have been generations. But it was not just any family history, it was his family history, dating back further than any oral tradition he had known. Ulfar lifted the chronicle from its resting place with the reverence he might have shown a holy relic. The first page bore an inscription in his mother's handwriting, "For my son, that he might know who he truly is." Below that, in much older script, was written the true record of the Astridson line, keepers of the old ways, guardians of forgotten wisdom. As he began to read, the familiar story of his heritage transformed into something far more complex and meaningful. The Astridsons were not simply another clan of farmers and fishermen who had taken up weapons when raiders threatened their shores. They were descendants of the old seers, the wise ones who had guided Norse kings before Christianity had swept across the north like wildfire. His great-grandmother had been Ingrid the Farseer, whose visions had saved 3 villages from famine by warning them to store grain during a year of plenty. His grandfather, Magnus Truthspeaker, had served as advisor to jarls and kings. His counsel sought on matters of war and peace. And his mother, Astrid the Wise, had inherited more than just the family name. She had carried within her the old knowledge that was rapidly disappearing from the world. The Chronicle told a different story of the raid that had destroyed their village. It had not been a random attack by Danish wolves seeking easy plunder. It had been a deliberate strike ordered by Christian zealots who sought to eliminate the last practitioners of the old religion. Astrid had not simply fled in panic. She had been warned by a dream vision 3 days before the attack. Page by page, Ulfar read how his mother had prepared for the coming catastrophe. She had buried the family treasures where the raiders would not find them. She had arranged for the evacuation of other families who still honored the old ways. And she had made the hardest choice of all, to flee separately from her son, knowing that a woman traveling with a child would move too slowly to escape the pursuit that was sure to follow. The Chronicle revealed that she had not abandoned him, as some dark corner of his heart had always feared. She had made the sacrifice of separation to ensure his survival, trusting that his uncle, a good man, but one who had already turned to the Christian faith, would raise him safely in the new order that was coming to the north. But the most shocking revelation came in the pages that detailed her journey to the mountains. Astrid had not chosen this valley at random. It was a sacred place, known to their family for generations. as a refuge where the old knowledge could be preserved when the world became too dangerous for those who remembered the ancient ways. The valley had been used by their ancestors for centuries as a place of retreat and meditation. Hidden caches of food and supplies had been maintained here by the Astridson line for generations, always kept ready for the time when persecution might drive them from their homes. Astrid had simply activated contingency plans that had been laid down by her own grandmother decades before. More than that, the Chronicle revealed that she had not spent 30 years simply waiting for his return. She had been working, preserving, preparing. The house itself was built according to ancient designs, positioned to channel the natural energies of the valley in ways that promoted healing and wisdom. Every beam, every stone, every carved symbol had been placed with purpose and intent. In the margins of the Chronicle, Ulfar found his mother's own additions to the family record. She had documented her years in the valley with the same careful attention to detail that characterized the earlier entries. But where the ancient scribes had written of kings and battles, Astrid had recorded something different, the gradual transformation of a place of refuge into a place of power. She wrote of dreams that came with unusual clarity in the mountain air, visions that showed her glimpses of possible futures, including many where her son appeared as an older man, weary of war and seeking peace. She had seen him climbing the mountain paths, had watched him discover the valley, had witnessed his shock at finding the impossible house, but she had also seen darker possibilities, futures where he never grew tired of killing, where the warrior's path consumed him entirely until nothing remained but empty violence. Timelines where he died in battle after battle, never finding the peace that might have saved his soul. It was these visions that had driven her to make the valley into more than just a hiding place. She had transformed it into a sanctuary that could heal even the deepest wounds. The Chronicle explained mysteries that had puzzled him since his arrival. Why the house felt larger inside than outside. It had been built using techniques known to the ancient builders, methods that created space within space through careful attention to angles and proportions. Why the fire never seemed to need tending. The hearth had been constructed over a natural gas seep that provided steady heat, while the chimney had been designed to draw air in precise patterns that kept the flame burning cleanly. Why the very air of the valley seemed to ease the weight in his chest. The mountains themselves created a natural barrier against the chaotic energies of the outside world, while the waterfall and streams carried away negative influences that might otherwise accumulate. As he read deeper into the family history, Ulfar began to understand that his mother's survival and flight to the valley was not a tragic accident, but the fulfillment of a destiny that stretched back through generations. The Astridson line had always produced guardians, people who preserved wisdom and provided sanctuary for those who sought healing from the wounds that life inevitably inflicted. And now, it seemed that responsibility had passed to him. The discovery that would change everything lay beneath his feet. Ulfar had spent the morning exploring the two smaller rooms of the house, a sleeping chamber where his mother's simple bed remained neatly made, and a storage room filled with preserved foods, tools, and supplies that could sustain someone through the harshest mountain winters. But it was when he returned to the main room and noticed the unusual pattern in the hearthstone that his breath caught in his throat. The stones of the fireplace were arranged in a design he had not seen the night before, or perhaps grief had blinded him to details that now seemed impossible to miss. Set into the hearth's foundation was a circle of 12 stones, each carved with a different rune, surrounding a larger central stone that bore symbols he recognized as binding runes, marks used to seal sacred spaces or important burials. His hands shook as he knelt before the hearth. The fire had burned low, leaving only glowing embers that cast dancing shadows across the carved symbols. Following an instinct he could not name, Ulfar began to carefully remove the smaller stones from around the central marker. each one lifted easily, as if they had been recently disturbed. And beneath them he found a cavity lined with smooth river rocks. The central stone was larger and heavier than the others, requiring both his massive hands to lift it clear. Beneath lay a sight that brought him to his knees with a sound that was half sob, half prayer. His mother's remains rested in the space below the hearth, but they had been arranged with such care and love that the sight held no horror, only profound peace. Her bones had been wrapped in white linen embroidered with protective runes, and around her were placed the small treasures that had meant the most to her in life. A silver pendant he remembered her wearing, carved with the image of a tree whose roots and branches formed an endless knot. A pair of bone needles she had used for her finest embroidery. A small carved bird that had been a gift from his father before Ulfar was born. But it was the letter, sealed with wax and marked with his name, that made his vision blur with tears he could no longer hold back. The parchment crackled softly as he broke the seal, and his mother's familiar handwriting swam before his eyes as he read words that had been waiting for him across the years. My beloved son, if you are reading this, then you have found your way home at last. I pray to the old gods that your journey has not been too hard, that you have found in your warrior's path some measure of the honor that burns so brightly in your heart. I am dying. Ulfar, the mountain winters have taken their toll, and my body grows weak while my spirit yearns to join your father in whatever realm awaits us beyond this life. But I do not go into that darkness with sorrow, for I have had 30 years to prepare this place for you. 30 years to gather the wisdom you will need when you finally lay down your sword. You were always meant to be more than a warrior, my son. Even as a child, you showed the gifts that mark our bloodline. The ability to see deeper than surface appearances, to sense the currents of fate that flow beneath the actions of men. I knew that someday the warrior's path would no longer satisfy you, that you would hunger for something beyond the endless cycle of battle and death. This valley is yours now, as it was mine, as it was my mother's before me. In the Chronicle you will find the knowledge of our people, the wisdom of the old ways that grows more precious with each passing year. The world outside changes rapidly. Kings rise and fall, religions spread and fade, but here in this sacred place, the ancient truths remain constant. I have seen you in my dreams. Ulfar, I have watched you grow from the frightened boy who fled our burning village into a man whose strength could shake mountains. But I have also seen the weariness in your eyes, the weight of all the lives you have taken in service to causes that meant nothing to your heart. You are tired, my son, and that tiredness is not weakness. It is wisdom finally awakening. Forgive me for the years we lost, for the choice I made to flee without you. I believed then that you would be safer raised by others, protected from the persecution that followed those who kept the old faith. Perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps I should have taken you with me and trusted that love would be protection enough. But the past cannot be changed, only honored, and I honor it by preparing this place where you can finally rest. The valley will heal you if you let it. The mountains will wash away the blood from your hands and the screams from your dreams. The silence here is not empty but full of the voices of our ancestors, full of the wisdom of the earth itself, full of the love I have carried for you through every season of separation. When you are ready, you will understand your true purpose. You were not born to be Ulfar Ironhand, dealer of death. You were born to be Ulfar Astridsson, keeper of life, guardian of the sacred flame that must not be allowed to die in this world that grows colder and darker with each passing year. I go now to my rest with joy, knowing that you will find these words when the time is right. Tend the fire, my son. Keep the old ways alive, and know that though we were separated by years and distance, you have carried my love with you in every step of your journey. Until we meet again in the halls beyond the sunset, I remain your loving mother. Astrid the Wise. Ulfar read the letter 3 times before its meaning fully penetrated the haze of grief and wonder that surrounded him. His mother had not simply died and been buried here. She had prepared her own resting place with the careful attention to detail that marked all her work. She had arranged to be interred beneath the hearth so that in some mystical way she could continue to tend the sacred fire that was the heart of the sanctuary. More than that, she had timed her death to coincide with his arrival. The final entry in her journal was dated 3 months past, around the time when his disillusionment with the warrior's life had reached its breaking point. She had seen his approach in visions and had prepared everything for the moment when he would finally climb the mountain paths to find her. The realization staggered him. His mother had died recently enough that if he had left the battlefield even a few weeks earlier, he might have found her alive. They might have had time together, time to speak the words that had waited 30 years to be said. The cruelty of this near miss threatened to break his heart entirely. But as he knelt beside her remains, another truth slowly dawned. She had not waited to die until he arrived because she wanted to burden him with regret. She had waited because her work was not finished, could not be finished, until she had passed the guardianship of this place to him. Her death was not a tragedy but a completion, the final act in a 30-year preparation for his homecoming. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of discovery and transformation that Ulfar could never have imagined. Each dawn brought new revelations about the valley, about his mother's work, and about the man he was slowly becoming as the weight of his warrior identity began to fall away like old armor finally removed. He had reverently replaced the hearthstones over his mother's resting place, but not before adding his own offering to those that surrounded her, a small piece of whetstone from his pack. Worn smooth by years of sharpening skull splitter, it seemed fitting that the tool he had used to maintain his weapon should now rest with the woman who had prepared the sanctuary where that weapon might finally be laid aside. The valley revealed new secrets daily. Behind the house, following a path marked by the same ancient cairns that had guided him through the mountain passes, he discovered a garden that defied all logic. Here, protected by the towering stone walls and warmed by underground springs, grew plants that should not survive at such altitude. Medicinal herbs that his mother had cultivated with obvious care, vegetables that could sustain a household through the longest winters, and flowers whose beauty served no purpose except to remind the soul that loveliness still existed in the world. The garden was another piece of his mother's careful preparation. Among the plants, he found notes written on bark and tied to stakes, explaining the properties of each species and the best times for harvesting. Mountain sage for clearing troubled thoughts, valerian root for peaceful sleep, a dozen varieties of healing plants that could treat everything from infected wounds to the deeper ailments that plagued the spirit. Working in the garden became his first daily ritual. The simple acts of weeding, watering, and tending growing things felt foreign to hands that had known only weapons for so many years. Yet there was something profoundly satisfying about nurturing life rather than ending it, about coaxing green shoots from dark earth instead of spilling red blood on dark battlefields. It was while working among the herbs that he discovered the sacred well, hidden among a grove of mountain ash trees whose berries glowed like tiny lanterns in the morning light. The well was ancient beyond measure, its stones worn smooth by countless hands that had drawn water from its depths. Carved around its rim were runes that spoke of purification, of renewal, of the eternal cycle that connected all living things. The water from the well was unlike any he had ever tasted, clean and cold, but with an undertone of minerals that seemed to carry the essence of the mountains themselves. When he drank from it, his dreams that night were filled with visions of his ancestors, generations of wise men and women who had walked these paths before him. They spoke to him without words, showing him glimpses of the knowledge he would need to carry forward. One vision showed him the construction of the house itself, revealing that every beam and stone had been placed according to patterns older than recorded history. The building was not simply shelter, but a kind of instrument, designed to gather and focus the natural energies that flowed through the valley like invisible rivers. The hearth where his mother rested was the heart of this system, the point where all the converging forces found their balance. Another vision revealed the true purpose of the chronicle he had discovered. It was not merely a family history, but a repository of practical wisdom accumulated across generations. Hidden within the seemingly simple records of births, deaths, and clan politics were instructions for maintaining the sanctuary, for reading the signs that foretold changes in weather and season, for performing the rituals that kept the valley's protective barriers strong. But perhaps the most significant discovery came when he found the workshop, a cave behind the waterfall that had been transformed into something that belonged more in the hall of a master craftsman than in a mountain wilderness. Here his mother had spent her years creating objects of power, amulets carved with protective runes, tools blessed for specific purposes, and most remarkably, a collection of staffs that seemed to hum with contained energy. The wisdom staff, as it was labeled in his mother's careful script, was clearly meant for him. Carved from ash wood that had been shaped by lightning strike, it bore his true name in runes along its length, along with symbols that represented the various aspects of knowledge he would need to master. At its head was mounted a crystal unlike any he had ever seen, clear as water, but shot through with veins of silver that seemed to move in response to his touch. When he first grasped the staff, Ulfar felt a shock of recognition that went deeper than memory. This was no ordinary walking stick, but a focus for abilities he had never known he possessed. As his fingers traced the carved runes, he began to understand that the weariness and disillusionment that had driven him from the battlefield had been more than simple exhaustion. They had been the first stirrings of awakening to powers that lay dormant in his bloodline. The staff amplified his natural sensitivity to the currents of energy that flowed through all living things. Holding it, he could sense the health of the plants in the garden, could feel the movement of water through underground channels, could even detect the presence of the mountain animals that occasionally wandered into the valley's borders. More unsettling was his growing ability to sense things beyond the physical world. When the wind blew from the south, carrying news from the lands below, he began to pick up impressions of distant events. Battles fought and won, villages burned, families scattered by the endless conflicts that plagued the world beyond the mountains. The knowledge came to him unbidden, fragments of vision and feeling that painted a picture of a realm grown increasingly chaotic as the old. Certainties crumbled. These glimpses of the outside world only reinforced his sense that he had found sanctuary at exactly the right moment. The age of the sword was ending, giving way to something newer and more complex. Kings were learning to rule through politics rather than personal combat. Warriors were becoming soldiers in larger armies controlled by distant lords. The individual heroism that had defined his youth was becoming obsolete, replaced by organized warfare that left little room for personal honor. In the valley, removed from these larger currents of change, he began to understand his mother's vision more clearly. She had not simply created a hiding place, but a preserve where the older values could survive the transformation of the world. Here the wisdom of his ancestors could be maintained and passed on to future generations, who might hunger for something deeper than the material success that seemed to drive the new age. Yet even as he embraced this new understanding of his purpose, doubts crept in during the long mountain nights. Was he truly capable of the transformation his mother had envisioned? Could hands that had dealt so much death ever learn to nurture life? Was it possible for Ulfar Ironhand to become Ulfar the Wise? Or was he fooling himself about the possibility of redemption? The first real test of his transformation came with the arrival of winter's early scouts, fierce storms that turned the mountain passes treacherous and cut the valley off from the outside world entirely. Ulfar had weathered many harsh seasons during his warrior years, huddled in temporary shelters with his battle brothers, sharing body heat and dwindling supplies while they waited for fighting weather to return. But this was different. For the first time in his adult life, he faced the cold months alone, dependent entirely on his own resources and the preparations his mother had made. The isolation that had seemed so appealing during the warm days of late summer took on a more challenging aspect when snow began to fall in, earnest, and the wind howled through. The peaks like the voices of angry gods, yet the house proved itself equal to the mountain's fury. The thick walls and carefully designed interior spaces maintained comfortable warmth even when ice formed on the windows and the waterfall froze into a cascade of crystal. His mother's stores of preserved food were more extensive than he had first realized, hidden in root cellars and cold chambers that kept meat and vegetables fresh throughout the darkest months. More importantly, the long winter nights gave him uninterrupted time to study the Chronicle and explore the deeper mysteries of the sanctuary. By candlelight, he read accounts of previous guardians who had faced their own periods of doubt and transformation. His great-grandfather Magnus had been a merchant who abandoned profitable trading ventures to take up the keeper's role. His great-great-grandmother Sigrid had been a jarl's daughter who renounced wealth and status to maintain the old ways. Each had struggled with the same questions that plagued him. Was the sacrifice worth making? Could one person really make a difference in preserving wisdom that the larger world seemed determined to forget? How could they know if their work would matter to future generations who might never even learn of the sanctuary's existence? The answers, when they came, arrived not through intellectual understanding, but through direct experience. During a particularly fierce blizzard that lasted 3 days and nights, Ulfar found himself maintaining a constant vigil by the sacred fire. The flames required careful tending during such storms, as the wind could create dangerous drafts that might either snuff out the fire entirely or send sparks to ignite the wooden beams above. As he fed wood to the flames and watched the patterns of light and shadow dance across the walls, Ulfar began to experience something he had never known during his warrior years: profound peace. Not the simple absence of conflict, but a positive sense of being exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The restlessness that had driven him from battlefield to battlefield was gone, replaced by a contentment that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the house. The revelation brought with it a flood of memories from his childhood, fragments of experience that took on new meaning in light of his current understanding. He remembered his mother's calm presence during storms, the way she had seemed to draw strength from adversity rather than being diminished by it. He recalled her saying that the greatest battles were not fought with swords, but with patience. That true victory came not from defeating enemies, but from maintaining hope when hope seemed impossible. During the long winter, he also began to experience the first stirrings of the prophetic dreams that had marked his family line for generations. These were not the chaotic nightmares that had plagued his warrior years, filled with blood and screaming and the faces of the dead. Instead, they were clear visions that showed him glimpses of possible futures stretching out from the choices he made in the present. One recurring dream showed him an older version of himself, beard gone completely white, welcoming travelers to the valley. Some came seeking healing from physical wounds, others from spiritual injuries that ran deeper than any blade could reach. In the dream, he possessed knowledge that could ease their suffering, wisdom that helped them find their own paths to peace. Another vision revealed a time of great turmoil in the lands below, when wars would rage across the continent, and refugees would flee into the mountains seeking sanctuary. The valley would become a beacon of safety, a place where the displaced could rebuild their lives and rediscover hope. But this future was not guaranteed. It depended on choices yet to be made, preparations yet to be completed. The most disturbing dream showed him a different path entirely. In this version of the future, he abandoned the valley and returned to the warrior's life, drawn back by news of some great conflict that seemed to require his particular skills. But the man who descended from the mountains was not the same one who had climbed them, seeking peace. The time in the sanctuary had changed him in ways that made him unfit for the old life. He became a figure of terrible power, wielding both sword and sorcery with devastating effect, but ultimately destroying everything he touched because he had tried to merge two incompatible paths. This dark vision served as a warning about the dangers of attempting to return to his former identity. The transformation he was undergoing was irreversible. He could not be both Ulfar Ironhand and Ulfar the Wise. He had to choose one path and commit to it completely. The choice became easier as winter deepened, and he discovered yet another aspect of the sanctuary that his mother had prepared for him. In the deepest part of the cave system behind the waterfall, he found a chamber that served as both library and scriptorium. Here, protected from moisture and temperature changes, were stored scrolls and books that represented centuries of accumulated wisdom. Some were copies of texts that had been lost to the outside world when Christian zealots burned the temples, and halls where the old knowledge had been preserved. Others were original works created by the guardians themselves, recording insights and discoveries made during their years of solitude and study. Together, they formed a repository of learning that was probably unique in the northern world, but what moved Ulfar most deeply was discovering that his mother had been working on a new addition to this collection during her final years. She had been writing what she called The Warrior's Return, a guide for those who had lived lives of violence and now sought to find meaning in peace. The text was unfinished, ending abruptly with the words, "The greatest victory a warrior can achieve is the conquest of his own need for conquest." Reading these words, Ulfar understood that his mother had been preparing not just the sanctuary, but the specific wisdom he would need for his own transformation. She had foreseen the exact nature of his struggle and had begun creating the tools he would need to navigate the difficult passage from destroyer to preserver. Spring came to the valley with unusual fury, as if the mountains themselves were eager to shed winter's grip. The ice that had locked the waterfall in crystal silence for months shattered with sounds like breaking thunder, and within days the air filled with the roar of rushing water and the sweet scent of new growth. Ulfar emerged from the long season of solitude, feeling like a man reborn, his connection to the sanctuary and its purposes stronger than ever, but it was the arrival of an unexpected visitor that would shatter every assumption he had made about his new life. He first noticed the smoke rising from beyond the valley's eastern rim, a thin, steady column that spoke of a controlled fire rather than wildfire or accident. For 3 days he watched it, debating whether to investigate. His mother's warnings about the necessity of secrecy echoed in his mind, but so did the prophetic dreams that had shown him welcoming travelers in need. On the 4th morning, the decision was made for him. A figure appeared at the mouth of the valley, moving slowly but with obvious purpose toward the house. Even at a distance, there was something familiar about the way the stranger carried himself, a bearing that spoke of military training and hard-won experience. As the visitor drew closer, Ulfar's breath caught in his throat. The man approaching was Gunnar Wolfsbane, one of his oldest battle brothers and among the few survivors of their last campaign. But this was not the proud warrior Ulfar remembered. Gunnar moved with the careful gait of someone nursing serious wounds, and his face bore the hollow look of a man who had seen too much and found no meaning in the seeing. "So this is where the great Ulfar Ironhand has been hiding," Gunnar said when he finally reached the house, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and something that might have been accusation. "Do you know how long I've been searching for you?" Ulfar felt the careful peace of his winter contemplation crack like thin ice. "Brother, what brings you to this place? How did you even find it?" Gunnar laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You're not the only one with ghosts to guide him, old friend. My dreams have been full of burning villages and a mountain house where a dead woman waits to welcome her son home. I finally grew tired of trying to understand what they meant and decided to follow them instead." The revelation that Gunnar had been receiving visions related to the sanctuary sent a chill through Ulfar that had nothing to do with the mountain air. According to the Chronicle, Only those with the blood of the old families should be able to sense the valley's location. Yet here stood his battle brother, a man whose ancestry ran to common farmers and fishermen, speaking of prophetic dreams that had led him directly to the hidden refuge. "There's something you need to know," Gunnar continued, settling heavily onto a stone bench outside the house. "Something that's going to change how you see everything that's happened to you." Ulfar's hand moved instinctively toward where Skullsplitter usually hung at his side, then stopped when he remembered that the great axe now rested inside the house, rarely touched since winter's arrival. The gesture was not lost on Gunnar, who smiled grimly. "Still the warrior, even after months of playing hermit? Good. You're going to need those instincts for what I have to tell you." Gunnar reached into his travel pack and withdrew an object that made Ulfar's world tilt sideways. It was a piece of carved bone, yellowed with age, bearing runes that marked it as a message token of the highest importance. But it was not the bone itself that staggered him. It was the symbol carved into its surface. The same tree and roots design that adorned his mother's cloak and the stones of the hearth. "This came to me from a dying woman in a village 2 days' ride south of here," Gunnar said, his voice taking on the formal cadence used for the delivery of important news. "She claimed to be your aunt, sister to Astrid the Wise. Before she died, she told me things about your family that I think you need to hear. The woman's name, according to Gunnar, had been Solveig the Truthkeeper, and she had spent 30 years believing her sister was dead and her nephew lost to the warrior's path with no hope of redemption. But in her final illness, she had experienced visions that revealed not only Astrid's survival, but the true purpose behind the raid that had destroyed their village so many years ago. The attack was not ordered by Christian zealots," Gunnar continued, his words striking Ulfar like physical blows. "It was arranged by members of your own family, distant cousins who had converted to the new faith and saw the old knowledge as a threat to their advancement in the changing world." The revelation reframed everything Ulfar thought he understood about his past. The raid had not been a random tragedy or even religious persecution, but a calculated betrayal by those who should have been protectors of the family traditions. Astrid had fled not just from foreign enemies, but from kinsmen who had decided that the old ways were too dangerous to preserve. But Solveig's revelations went deeper still. According to her deathbed confessions, relayed now through Gunnar's grim recitation, there had been other survivors of the family line scattered across the northern lands. Some had hidden their heritage and lived as ordinary farmers or craftsmen. Others had maintained the old practices in secret, passing down fragments of the ancient wisdom through hidden bloodlines. Most shocking of all was the news that Ulfar was not the last of his line, as he had always believed. Somewhere in the world was a daughter of his cousin Eric, a young woman named Ragnhild, who had inherited both the family gifts and the responsibility to preserve them. She had been raised by foster parents who knew nothing of her true heritage. But her abilities had begun manifesting as she reached womanhood. "Solveig made me swear an oath before she died," Gunnar said, producing a second message token from his pack. "I was to find you and deliver this warning. The same enemies who destroyed your village are still active. They've been hunting down the surviving bloodlines, eliminating any who might carry on the old traditions. And they know about this place." The second token bore a message that made Ulfar's blood run cold. Written in his aunt's careful script were words that shattered his sense of safety. "The sanctuary is compromised. They come with the summer storms. Prepare for war or prepare to die." Gunnar continued his grim recitation. A group of warrior monks had been systematically tracking down and eliminating the scattered remnants of the old families. They called themselves the Purifiers, claiming divine sanction for their work of erasing what they saw as demonic influences from the northern lands. Their methods were brutal and thorough. Entire bloodlines had vanished without trace, their homes burned, their knowledge lost forever. But the Purifiers had made a mistake in attacking Solveig's village. She had been ready for them, had used the old skills to hide crucial information before they could extract it from her. Instead of learning the sanctuary's location directly, they had captured only fragments, enough to know that such a place existed, but not enough to find it immediately. "That's why I've been searching for you," Gunnar explained. "Solveig's visions showed her that you were the key to everything, the last guardian capable of preserving what remains of the old knowledge. But she also saw that you couldn't do it alone, not against enemies who combine religious fervor with military skill." The implications were staggering. Ulfar had thought himself done with warfare, had believed that his transformation into a keeper of wisdom meant leaving violence behind forever. But the sanctuary and everything it preserved was under direct threat from forces that would show no mercy and accept no compromise. More than that, there were others out there, surviving members of his family line, who needed protection and guidance. The prophetic dreams that had shown him welcoming travelers to the valley had not been symbolic visions of some distant future. They had been warnings about responsibilities he would face much sooner than expected. "There's one more thing," Gunnar said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Solveig believed that your mother's death was not natural. The timing was too convenient, coming just before your arrival. She thinks the purifiers have agents who can reach even into hidden places, that they somehow hastened Astrid's end to prevent her from preparing you properly for what's coming. The possibility that his mother had been murdered, that her peaceful death had been anything but peaceful, threatened to reawaken the berserker rage that had made Ulfar Ironhand a name spoken in whispers across the northern battlefields. For a moment, his vision actually blurred with the red haze he remembered from his most savage fighting days. But then the wisdom staff, leaning against the house's doorframe, seemed to pulse with gentle light, and he felt the calming influence of the sanctuary flow through him. The rage was still there, but it was contained now, controlled, waiting to be channeled toward constructive purpose rather than blind destruction. The transformation his mother had envisioned was not yet complete, but it was deep enough to prevent him from losing himself entirely to the old patterns of violence. He could feel the warrior and the wise man within him beginning to merge into something new, something that could protect the sanctuary without being consumed by the need for vengeance. The days that followed, Gunnar's arrival passed in a blur of urgent preparation that tested everything Ulfar had learned about, balancing his warrior instincts with his newfound wisdom. The sanctuary that had been a place of healing and contemplation now transformed into something resembling a fortress, though one protected by methods that went far beyond conventional fortification. Working with the Chronicle as his guide, Ulfar began activating defenses that his ancestors had built into the valley itself over the course of generations. Hidden throughout the rocky walls were carved runes that could be awakened with the proper rituals, creating barriers that would confuse and disorient intruders. The waterfall could be partially diverted through ancient channels, flooding the main approach to the house and making cavalry assault impossible. Most significantly, the network of caves behind the cascade could serve as a refuge that enemies might search for years without finding. But these preparations, intricate as they were, represented only the physical aspects of the sanctuary's defense. The true power of the place lay in its ability to affect the minds and spirits of those who entered with hostile intent. The Chronicle spoke of invaders who had found the valley in ages past, only to become hopelessly lost within its confines despite its relatively small size. Others had fled in terror from visions that manifested their deepest fears and guilts. Ulfar threw himself into mastering these more esoteric defenses with the same intensity he had once brought to weapon training. The wisdom staff became his constant companion as he walked the hidden paths that crisscrossed the valley, learning to sense the ebb and flow of energies that most men could not even imagine. Where his ancestors had taken decades to fully understand these mysteries, he had perhaps weeks before the purifiers arrived. Gunnar proved an unexpected asset in these preparations. Despite his lack of mystical heritage, Years of campaigning had given him a practical understanding of siege warfare that complemented Ulfar's growing supernatural abilities. Together, they identified choke points where a few defenders could hold off larger forces, cached supplies in hidden locations, and planned fallback positions that could be held even if the main house was overrun. More importantly, Gunnar's presence forced Ulfar to confront questions about his transformation that he might otherwise have avoided. Could a man truly change his fundamental nature, or was the warrior always lurking beneath whatever peaceful facade he constructed? When violence became necessary, and they both knew it would become necessary, could he access his old skills without losing the hard-won wisdom that now defined him? The answer came during their third night of preparation, when Ulfar descended into the deepest part of the cave system to retrieve weapons that had been stored there by previous guardians. The armory was unlike anything he had expected, not a collection of crude tools hastily hidden, but a carefully curated selection of arms and armor that represented centuries of craftsmanship and mystical enhancement. At the center of the collection hung a suit of mail that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal in the torchlight. Beside it stood a sword, whose blade bore no nicks or rust, despite obvious great age, its edge still sharp enough to part silk dropped upon it. But it was the helm that drew his attention most powerfully, a work of art that covered the entire head while somehow allowing perfect vision and hearing. As he lifted the helm to examine its construction more closely, Ulfar felt a shock of recognition that went beyond the physical object itself. This was the ceremonial armor of the sanctuary's guardians, worn not for protection in battle, but for the psychological effect it would have on enemies who faced a defender armored in legend itself. The Chronicles spoke of raiders fleeing at the mere sight of the guardian in armor, their courage broken by confronting something that seemed more than human. But wearing the armor required more than simply putting it on. The Chronicles were clear that it could only be donned by one who had achieved the proper balance between warrior and wise man, between the need to preserve life and the willingness to take it when preservation demanded violence. Ulfar spent long hours in meditation before the sacred fire, seeking within himself the synthesis that would allow him to be both protector and destroyer, without being corrupted by either role. The breakthrough came when he finally understood that his mother's transformation of the sanctuary had been about more than simply creating a refuge. She had been preparing a place where the apparent contradictions of existence could be reconciled, where wisdom and strength, peace and war, preservation and destruction could coexist without canceling each other out. The valley itself was a physical manifestation of this balance, and he was being called to embody that same synthesis in his own person. When he finally donned the Guardian's armor, it fit as if it had been made specifically for his frame. The mail flowed over his shoulders like water, finding its proper course, while the helm settled onto his head with a sense of rightness that was almost musical. Looking at his reflection in the still water of the sacred well, Ulfar saw neither the blood-mad berserker he had been, nor the peaceful hermit he had tried to become, but something new, a figure that radiated both compassion and implacable resolve. Gunnar's reaction when he emerged from the caves confirmed the transformation. His old battle brother, who had faced kings and monsters without flinching, actually took a step backward when he saw the armored figure approaching through the morning mist. "By Thor's hammer," Gunnar whispered. "You look like something out of the old stories. If I didn't know it was you inside that armor, I'd be reaching for my weapons." But the armor was only one element of the preparation that consumed their days. Following instructions hidden within the Chronicles' most cryptic passages, Ulfar began the process of awakening the valley's dormant guardian spirits, entities that his ancestors had bound to the sanctuary's service through oaths and offerings that stretched back beyond memory. These were not the ghosts of dead warriors, as he had first assumed, but something far older and more primal. They were aspects of the mountain itself, manifestations of the raw forces that had shaped stone and carved valleys over endless ages. Calling them forth required rituals that pushed his understanding of the old ways to its limits. Ceremonies that left him drained and shaking, but filled with a sense of power unlike anything he had known even in the height of his warrior prime. The first spirit to answer his call manifested as a wolf of impossible size, its fur the color of storm clouds, and its eyes like chips of glacial ice. It padded around the valley's perimeter for 3 days, marking boundaries that would warn any with supernatural senses that this place was protected by forces beyond mortal comprehension. The second spirit took the form of a raven whose wings blotted out the sun when it flew overhead. Its role was to serve as scout and messenger, ranging far beyond the valley to observe the movements of potential enemies and report back through dreams and omens that Ulfar was learning to interpret with increasing accuracy. But it was the third spirit that made even Gunnar understand they were no longer dealing with ordinary warfare. It manifested as a figure of living stone, shaped like a man, but twice the height and 3 times the breadth of any mortal warrior. When it walked, the ground shook. When it gestured, avalanches rearranged distant peaks. This was the guardian of last resort, the force that would be unleashed only if all other defenses failed. Through the Raven's reconnaissance, they learned that their time for preparation was almost over. A force of 30 purifiers was making its way through the lower mountains, moving with the methodical precision of professional soldiers rather than the wild enthusiasm of fanatic zealots. They were led by a warrior priest whose reputation for destroying places of the old power was known even to Ulfar, Brother Marcus the Cleanser, a former Viking who had converted to the new faith with the fervor of the twice-born. Marcus had raised 7 sacred groves, destroyed 4 ancient temples, and was credited with the elimination of at least 3 family lines that had maintained the old traditions. He was no mere religious fanatic, but a skilled tactician who understood both the practical and mystical aspects of the warfare he waged. The force he led combined the military discipline of professional soldiers with the unshakable conviction of true believers. But the Raven brought other intelligence that was both encouraging and troubling. Traveling with the Purifiers, apparently as their prisoner, was a young woman whose description matched what Gunnar had told him about his cousin's daughter. Ragnhild had been captured during the raid that killed Solveig, and Marcus was using her as both bait and trophy, proof of his success in hunting down the surviving bloodlines. The knowledge that his surviving family member was in enemy hands added a new dimension to the coming confrontation. It was no longer simply a matter of defending the sanctuary and its accumulated wisdom. He would have to rescue Ragnhild without allowing the Purifiers to destroy the very heritage he was trying to preserve for her. As the final night before the expected assault fell across the valley, Ulfar stood beside the sacred fire with Skull Splitter in one hand and the wisdom staff in the other. Around him, the awakened defenses hummed with contained power. Behind him, Gunnar checked their weapons and supplies one final time. Above him, the spirit raven circled in patterns that would confuse enemy scouts and hide the true nature of what awaited them. For the first time since childhood, Ulfar offered prayers to both the old gods and the new, asking not for victory, but for the wisdom to know when to fight and when to show mercy, when to destroy and when to preserve. The battle that would begin with dawn would determine not just his own fate, but the future of knowledge and traditions that stretched back to the beginning of the northern world. The boy who had fled a burning village 30 years ago was gone forever. The warrior who had carved his name in blood across a dozen battlefields was transformed beyond recognition. What remained was something unprecedented, a guardian who could wield both sword and spirit, who could preserve ancient wisdom while adapting to the demands of a changing world. Tomorrow would test whether that transformation was complete. Enough to face the greatest challenge of his life. The Purifiers came with the dawn, as the raven spirit had foretold, but their approach was unlike anything Ulfar had expected from his years of conventional warfare. Instead of the direct assault he had prepared for, they entered the valley in small groups, moving with the careful precision of hunters who understood they were entering dangerous territory. Brother Marcus the Cleanser led the first group himself, 5 men in the brown robes of warrior monks, their faces marked with ritual scars that proclaimed their dedication to the eradication of the old ways. They carried weapons blessed by their priests and wore amulets designed to ward off supernatural influences. But as they crossed the valley's threshold, Ulfar could see through the raven's eyes that their protections were already beginning to fail. The spirit wolf's boundary markers affected them first. Men who had marched in perfect formation began to stumble and separate, their sense of direction confused by forces they could not understand. One of the monks turned completely around and began walking back toward the valley entrance, convinced he was still advancing toward his target. Another stopped entirely, staring at something only he could see, his face pale with terror. Only Marcus himself seemed unaffected by the valley's defenses. The former Viking pressed forward with grim determination, his scarred features showing no sign of the supernatural influences that were reducing his followers to confused wanderers. In his hands, he carried a weapon that made Ulfar's blood run cold, a war hammer inscribed with Christian runes, but forged in the unmistakable style of the old smiths. This was no mere converted raider, but someone who understood both traditions well enough to use them against each other. "Show yourself, Guardian," Marcus called out when he reached the clearing before the house. "I know you watch me. I know you see the gift I bring." At his gesture, 2 more monks emerged from the tree line, dragging between them a young woman whose auburn hair and defiant bearing marked her unmistakably as family. Ragnhild bore the evidence of rough treatment. Torn clothing, bruised face, hands bound with iron chains that bore Christian symbols designed to suppress any mystical abilities she might possess. But it was her eyes that struck Ulfar most powerfully. Despite her captivity and obvious suffering, they burned with the same fierce intelligence he remembered from his mother's gaze. Here was someone who had inherited more than just bloodline. She carried the spirit of the old ways as surely as if Astrid herself had been reborn. "Your protections are impressive," Marcus continued, his voice carrying clearly across the valley despite the distance. "But they affect only those who come with pure intent. I carry too much of the old darkness within me to be turned aside by mere spirits and shadows." Ulfar stepped from the house wearing the Guardian's armor, skull splitter gleaming in his right hand and the wisdom staff crackling with contained power in his left. The morning sun caught the mail and threw back reflections that seemed to move independently of his body, creating an effect that made him appear larger and more imposing than his already considerable frame. "I am Ulfar Astridsson," he called back, his voice carrying the formal cadences used for challenges between worthy opponents. "Guardian of this place, keeper of the old ways, son of Astrid the Wise, you have entered sacred ground uninvited and brought violence to a place of peace. Withdraw now, and you may leave unharmed." Marcus laughed, a sound like breaking glass that echoed off the valley walls. Ulfar Ironhand the Kinslayer, the berserker who painted half of England red with Saxon blood. "Do you think a few months of playing hermit have cleansed you of what you are? I know your true nature, warrior. I was there at Stamford Bridge. I saw you cut down Harold Godwinson's personal, guard like wheat before the scythe. The revelation that Marcus had witnessed his actions during that final battle sent a shock through Ulfar's carefully maintained composure. The monk was not simply another zealot, but someone who had observed his warrior prowess firsthand and survived to plan this confrontation accordingly. "That man is dead," Ulfar replied, though he could feel the old battle rage stirring despite his efforts to remain calm. "I am something different now. Are you?" Marcus gestured to his captive. "Let us test that claim. This girl carries the bloodline you seek to preserve. She is the future of your precious tradition, the next keeper of secrets that should have died with your pagan ancestors. But I offer you a choice, Guardian. Face me in single combat as the old laws demand, and if you win, she goes free. If you lose, she dies with you, and the last of the old blood feeds the earth of this valley. It was a trap, and Ulfar knew it. Marcus was goading him into abandoning the sanctuary's defenses and the strategic advantages they provided. But it was also an opportunity. If he could defeat the Purifier leader in personal combat, the demoralized followers might retreat without forcing him to activate the more destructive guardians he had awakened. More importantly, it was the only chance he could see to rescue Ragnhild without endangering her life in a larger battle. The other purifiers were scattered throughout the valley, confused by the spirit defenses, but still dangerous if aroused to coordinated action. A direct assault on Marcus's position might result in her death before he could reach her. The old laws, Ulfar said slowly, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. Single combat, witnessed by both sides, fought until death or yield. Winner claims both victory and the life of the captive. Exactly as our ancestors would have done it, Marcus agreed. Unless, of course, your transformation has made you too weak to face a real warrior. The insult was calculated to provoke him into rash action, and Ulfar felt the familiar heat of berserker fury rising in response. But the wisdom staff pulsed with calming energy, reminding him that this was exactly what Marcus wanted. For him to fight as Ulfar Ironhand, rather than as the guardian he had become. The challenge would require him to integrate his two natures completely, to fight with the skill and strength of his warrior past, while maintaining the wisdom and control of his transformed present. It was the ultimate test of whether his months in the sanctuary had created something genuinely new or merely suppressed what he had always been. The single combat that followed would be remembered by the few, witnesses as something beyond ordinary warfare, as a clash between not just two warriors, but two entire world views, two different understandings of what strength and wisdom could become when merged in a single human soul. Marcus stepped into the circle marked by ancient stones, his blessed hammer singing through the air as he tested its balance. He had stripped away his monk's robes to reveal the scarred torso of a veteran warrior, his body marked by decades of battles fought in service to his adopted faith. But it was his eyes that revealed the true danger he represented. They held the cold certainty of a man who had never doubted the righteousness of his cause. Ulfar entered the circle from the opposite side, the guardian's armor flowing around him like liquid silver, while both Skull-Splitter and the Wisdom Staff seemed to pulse with their own inner light. He could feel the watching presence of the spirits he had awakened, could sense Gunnar's tension from his position overlooking the combat ground, could even perceive the frightened but defiant energy radiating from Ragnhild despite her bonds. But most powerfully, he felt his mother's presence rising from the hearthstone where her remains rested, not as a ghost or phantom, but as a living part of his own spirit. The wisdom she had accumulated through 30 years of solitude now flowing through him like a second bloodstream. "Come then." "On Kinslayer," Marcus taunted, raising his hammer in the formal salute that preceded honorable combat. "Let us see what your months of prayer and meditation have made of Ulfar Ironhand." The first exchange revealed that Marcus had not underestimated his opponent's transformation. Where the old Ulfar would have charged forward in a berserker fury, seeking to overwhelm his enemy through pure aggression, the Guardian moved with calculated precision. He flowed aside from Marcus's opening hammer strike, allowing the Wisdom Staff to deflect the weapon's momentum, while Skull-Splitter traced a careful arc that forced the monk to give ground. But Marcus was no ordinary opponent. His conversion to the Christian faith had not diminished his warrior skills, but refined them, adding discipline and tactical thinking to natural talent and hard-won experience. He recovered from the deflected attack instantly, spinning into a combination that forced Ulfar to retreat toward the circle's edge. "You fight like an old man, trying to remember his youth," Marcus called out as their weapons clashed again. "The fire is gone, Guardian. You've traded your strength for empty philosophy." For a moment the taunt struck home. Ulfar could feel the old patterns of combat calling to him, the familiar rhythm of violence that had carried him through so many battles. It would be easy to let go of restraint, to become once again the terrible force that had earned him his fearsome reputation. The berserker rage lay just beneath the surface, waiting to be unleashed. But then he heard Ragnhild's voice, cutting through the ring of clashing weapons. "Fight as yourself, cousin! Not as what they made you, but as what you chose to become." The words crystallized something that had been building within him throughout the combat. He was not trying to fight while suppressing his warrior nature. He was fighting as the synthesis of everything he had been and everything he had become. The Guardian's path did not require him to abandon strength, but to understand its proper use. When Marcus came at him again, Ulfar met the attack with a response that surprised them both. Instead of blocking the hammer strike, he stepped inside its arc and struck with the wisdom staff, not at his opponent's body, but at the blessed weapon itself. The staff's power shattered the runes that protected the hammer, leaving Marcus holding nothing more than mundane metal and wood. The monk's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in calculation. If mystical weapons were neutralized, the combat would be decided by pure skill and determination. He cast aside the broken hammer and drew a long sayax from his belt, the single-edged blade gleaming with deadly purpose. "So be it," Marcus said. "Steel against steel, as our ancestors fought before gods and spirits muddied the waters of honest conflict." But Ulfar had learned that true synthesis meant using every tool at his disposal. As they closed for the final exchange, he allowed the wisdom staff to fade into mist while Skullsplitter transformed in his hands. The ancient axe, exposed to months of the sanctuary's influence, revealed capabilities that even the old legends had not recorded. Its blade took on the silver light of the Guardian's armor, while its handle extended to match his changing grip. The final moments of the combat unfolded with a clarity that seemed to slow time itself. Marcus lunged forward with the desperate strength of a man who understood he was overmatched. His sayax sought the gap between helmet and mail, a killing stroke that would have felled any ordinary opponent. But Ulfar was no longer an ordinary opponent. He was the guardian of the sanctuary, wielder of both ancient strength and earned wisdom. Skullsplitter swept up in a perfectly timed arc that turned the monk's blade aside, while its return stroke ended the conflict with merciful swiftness. Marcus fell to his knees, then forward onto his face, his life's blood soaking into the sacred earth of the valley. Around the circle's perimeter, his surviving followers stared in shock at the defeat of the leader they had thought invincible. "The old laws," Ulfar called out, his voice carrying clearly through the morning air. "Single combat witnessed by all. Your leader is dead. Honor demands that you withdraw and leave this place in peace." But as he moved toward the bound Ragnhild, Ulfar realized that some battles ended only when all participants chose to let them end. The look in the surviving purifier's eyes suggested they might prefer martyrdom to the admission that their cause could be defeated by a single guardian. No matter how formidable, the silence that followed Marcus's death stretched across the valley like a held breath. Ulfar stood over his fallen opponent, Skullsplitter's blade clean despite the combat, the Guardian's armor still flowing with silver light that seemed to emanate from within rather than reflect the morning sun. Around the circle's perimeter, the surviving purifiers clutched their weapons with the desperate grip of men who understood their world had just changed in ways they could not comprehend. It was young brother Thomas who broke the standoff, dropping his sword with a clatter that echoed off the valley walls. "The old laws have been satisfied," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Single combat witnessed by all. We are bound by the outcome." One by one, the other monks followed his example, laying down their weapons with the reluctant acceptance of men who had been raised to honor certain codes, even when those codes conflicted with their immediate desires. But it was not fear of Ulfar's prowess that stayed their hands. It was the recognition that something far larger than personal combat had just taken place. They had witnessed the emergence of something their religious, training had told them was impossible. A perfect synthesis of the old ways and the new wisdom. A man who could wield ancient power without being corrupted by it, who could preserve tradition while adapting to a changing world. The very existence of such a figure challenged the fundamental assumptions that had driven their crusade against the old knowledge. Ulfar moved to where Ragnhild knelt, the iron chains that bound her hands already beginning to corrode under the influence of the sanctuary's power. As the metal crumbled away, she stood with a grace that reminded him powerfully of his mother, her auburn hair catching the light like a banner of defiance. "Cousin," she said simply, her voice carrying a warmth that spoke of family bonds stronger than years of separation. "I dreamed of this place of you long before these men found me. My foster parents said it was imagination, but I knew better." Looking into her eyes, Ulfar saw not just family resemblance, but the unmistakable signs of inherited gifts awakening. She carried within her the same potential that had marked their bloodline for generations, the ability to see deeper than surface appearances, to sense the currents of energy that flowed through all living things. But unlike him, she would not have to discover these abilities through decades of violence and regret. "The sanctuary is yours as much as mine," he told her, removing the guardian's helm so she could see his face clearly. "Our family has maintained this place for generations, waiting for the time when the world would need what we preserve." The transformation in the surviving purifiers was remarkable to witness. Led by Brother Thomas, they approached the circle not as conquerors, but as supplicants, their earlier certainty replaced by genuine curiosity about the mysteries they had sought to destroy. The valley's influence worked upon them as it had upon Ulfar himself, gradually wearing away the rigid dogma that had driven them to violence and replacing it with something approaching wisdom. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, directing his question to both Ulfar and Ragnhild. "We came here to eliminate what we saw as evil, but what we found instead was something we do not understand. Are we enemies still, or is there another path?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances. These men represented the new religious order that was sweeping across the northern lands, the force that would eventually reshape the spiritual landscape of the entire continent. Their conversion to a different understanding could influence countless others who might otherwise see the old wisdom as a threat to be eliminated. Ulfar exchanged a long look with Ragnhild, seeing in her slight nod the confirmation that she understood the opportunity being offered. The sanctuary had been built not just to preserve the old ways, but to serve as a bridge between what was passing and what was coming. This was the moment when that purpose could be fulfilled. "There is always another path for those with the courage to seek it," Ragnhild said, stepping forward with an authority that belied her youth. "You came here expecting to find darkness, but you have discovered light instead. The question is whether you can carry that light back to others who still stumble in shadow." Over the following days, the valley became a place of learning rather than conflict. The purifiers who had come to destroy remained to study, their weapons set aside in favor of the writing materials that Gunnar retrieved from the sanctuary's extensive supplies. Under Ulfar's guidance, they began to understand that the old wisdom and the new faith need not be enemies, that both sought to connect human beings with the divine, though through different methods and expressions. Brother Thomas proved especially receptive to these teachings, his scholarly background enabling him to grasp concepts that might have eluded men with less education. He began copying portions of the family chronicle, translating the ancient runes into Latin so that the wisdom they contained could be preserved in forms that Christian monasteries would accept and study. But it was Ragnhild who truly transformed the sanctuary's purpose. Working with the vision that had guided their family for generations, she began the process of turning the hidden valley into something unprecedented. A place where representatives of different spiritual traditions could come to study and learn from each other. The old knowledge would be preserved, but it would also evolve, incorporating new insights while maintaining its essential character. As autumn painted the mountain peaks with gold and crimson, Ulfar stood beside the sacred fire that had burned continuously throughout the confrontation and its aftermath. The wisdom staff rested against the mantelpiece above his mother's resting place, no longer needed as a weapon, but serving its true purpose as a symbol of knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Gunnar had chosen to remain as the sanctuary's guardian-at-arms, trading his wanderer's life for the deeper satisfaction of protecting something truly worth preserving. The former purifiers had become the first students of the new tradition Ragnhild was creating, their zealotry transformed into scholarly dedication. The boy who had fled a burning village 30 years ago was gone forever, as was the warrior who had carved his name in blood across northern battlefields. What remained was Ulfar Astridsson, guardian of wisdom, keeper of sacred flame, bridge between the world that was passing and the world that was coming. Standing in the house his mother had built with such love and foresight, surrounded by the family he had never expected to find, and the students who would carry the ancient wisdom into an uncertain future, Ulfar finally understood the true meaning of victory. It was not about defeating enemies, but about transforming them into allies. Not about preserving the past unchanged, but about helping it grow into something larger and more inclusive. The sacred fire burned on, as it always had, as it always would, tended now by hands that had learned to create rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, to build bridges rather than walls between the human heart and the divine mystery that surrounded all existence.